Transformers 1 brought many storylines and aspects from the deep Transformers lore to the silver screen. Chief among them all was the decision to depict Optimus Prime and Megatron as figurative brothers before the Cybertronian War began. Now, this concept of the two's relationship is not new to the franchise, but Transformers 1 expands upon it in a more significant way than we have seen previously. Most notably, Transformers Prime has become the most recognizable use of the brotherhood aspect, pitching the idea that Megatron and the young Orion Pax were lower-class citizens that, while from extremely different backgrounds, forged an alliance to better their home world. Megatron, for the most part, has always been portrayed as a miner-turned-gladiator in the pits of Iacon, a staple city in Decepticon culture. While he comes from humble beginnings, it's most common to see Megatron born into a system of violence and rage. So common, in fact, that most people don't ever question how he became a tyrant, but rather focus on his evil deeds in the aftermath of his actions. I'd like to clarify that Megatron's origins have been explored in great detail and to great effect, and while D-16's origin story does not stray far from this, it is executed with a few more shades of color that truly show off the creation of Megatron is only possible through the oppression of the weak. In Transformers 1, we are introduced to D-16 when Orion Pax is being chased by Cybertronian authorities. The difference between D and Pax is clear from the start. Pax is a smaller bot who gets into trouble by never following protocol, and D, his lifelong friend, is a stockier Cybertronian who finds no issue with his life as a miner. We see throughout the film that D-16 is always thankful for the opportunities of adventures brought on by Orion, and yet, at the first sight of trouble, he reverts to following his protocol. At this point in their lives, it seems quite often that the two get into trouble, as many higher-class Cybertronians even recognize Orion and use his name. There's a rich history that is implied in these scenes. Orion does something he shouldn't, gets into trouble, and D helps him get away with it. But no matter the hijinks, D-16 always tries to stay on what he believes is the right side of the law. Nowhere is this more apparent than later in the film when the main cast is faced with the truth of Cybertron's violent history. But before we get there, let's take a look at an earlier scene when the two brothers are thrust into the Iacon 3000 race, and both literally and figuratively are thrust into the spotlight.
Oh no. And they're off!
While he is originally against the idea, D-16 still participates in the race at a chance for glory. He may seem like a slave to the system, but deep down he craves to be more, just like Orion. That is, until the system threatens to beat him down and take away what it has given him. In the wake of losing the race, D-16's mood shifts from that of excitement and possibility to anger and accusations. He blames Orion for what is inevitable, the loss of their status in the system. He fears he will be demoted back down to a level 1 miner, but before he comes face to face with a fate much worse than this, he first interacts with Sentinel Prime. This is a pivotal moment for D-16, as he is face to face with who he believes to be the protector of not only Cybertron, but also the very system he believes in. Sentinel makes quick work of the two and orchestrates their disappearance, which they mistaken as being a misunderstanding when Darkwing disposes of them. I should say here that some people have a different interpretation of this scene, and that Sentinel did not orchestrate this event and simply was uncaring to actually stick around. The reason I read this scene as a part of Sentinel's plan was due to his sarcastic remark that he loves a bot who can think for himself. I personally found this to be a veiled threat towards Orion, but either way, if it was a part of Sentinel's plan or not, the outcome is the same. At this point, D-16 has begun to see the cracks in the system. What he was promised, Sentinel's attention, was not rightfully handed out to him. He is beginning to experience injustice in society. But D-16 hasn't fully turned on Sentinel and the system just yet, as while he and Orion traverse the surface of Cybertron, we get another glimpse of his view of an idealized world, where he presents the matrix of leadership to Sentinel and is given the dues he deserves. The hopes, however, are dashed when he learns of Sentinel's corruption. Moments before this scene, however, we get to see D-16 confront his true idol, Megatronus Prime. Said to be the greatest, strongest, and coolest of the Primes, he is angered, not at the death of his hero, but at whoever was responsible. The Primes were symbols of hope, loyalty, and most importantly, to D, raw power. To think that someone could overpower the great Megatronus was almost a fantasy, and yet that anger is fully realized once Alpha Trion reveals the true history of the Prime's deaths. D-16's anger towards the death of his hero is now wound up in his hatred for Sentinel's lies and mutilation of Cybertronians. We see now that D-16 has abandoned the system he so eagerly held onto before, and he has traded his somewhat sheepish attitude towards punishment for rage against those in authority. At the start of the film, D-16 is portrayed as a passive character. He doesn't make many decisions or take direct actions like Orion. Rather, he reacts to the world around him. Usually in media, this can come off as poor character writing, but in the film, D-16 evolves past his dormant self and becomes the new risk-taker of the group, much to Orion's dismay. This need for revenge growing in D's spark is finally shown off in his confrontation with the elite High Guard. He is now impatient and frustrated with the guerrilla tactics of the Resistance, and yet he agrees that all that matters is one bot's strength over another. I also find it very interesting that in his fight with Starscream, the activation of his fusion cannon is portrayed as a terrifying moment. Obviously, we see that the Transformers have built-in weaponry on their bodies, and yet at this point in the film, it has never been showcased so prominently. At the end of the film, Optimus's axe and B-127's knife hands come at a time of self-defense, showing us that they are using their natural abilities to protect themselves and others. They do use these weapons, to kill their enemies all the same, but I wanted to note how the film portrays them differently. D-16's cannon comes from his rage, and all the other bots present take note of this. Before Orion can confront his brother, Arachnid and Sentinel's forces disrupt the Resistance gathering and kidnap D and B-127. The following scenes are where we get to see D truly cast away the system he once lived in when he stands up to Sentinel. As he says in the movie, he has nothing left to lose in life. Nothing except for the one last remembrance of his brotherhood with Orion, his first edition Megatronus Prime decal. The last piece of his identity as D-16, brother of Orion Pax, is not discarded, but defaced into something monstrous. Sentinel has already mutilated D by way of removing his T-Cog, and so he does it once again by branding him with the mark that will soon be known as the Decepticon insignia. D-16's refusal to stay down after this action is when he begins his transformation into Megatron. While he physically does not change until later, this is the moment when his mind has been made up. Nothing will stand in his way of getting justice, not even his own brother. Orion pleads with D-16 not to be like Sentinel, but it's too late. D has evolved past the simple-minded and selfish nature of his greatest enemy. Stepping in the way of his revenge, Orion sacrifices himself not for Sentinel's life, but for the morality of his brother. One last-ditch effort to bring D-16 back from the brink, but it's too late. D-16's final moments fade away as Megatron is fully born, realizing that Orion has no place in the new world. D-16 would have saved his brother, but Megatron, as we heard before, will never trust another so-called leader. As Orion descends into the core of Cybertron, where he will receive the Matrix of Leadership and his new title, Megatron carries out what he believes to be justice by murdering Sentinel. There is no argument that Sentinel must pay for his atrocities, but trading one violent leader for another is not the way to evolve a society. Here we see the beginnings of what will become the Decepticons and their ideology, the belief that strength over another is all that matters. Megatron seeks not to rebuild Cybertron, but to tear down its monuments to Sentinel and anyone who opposes him.
Burn it down! All of it!
We have to stop him!
Even in facing the newly resurrected Optimus Prime, he rears his new hatred for the ways of old. He scoffs at Optimus for being granted the matrix of leadership. Here, standing before him is yet another Prime, a chosen leader, albeit more legitimately this time, that threatens to undo all of his work. In Megatron's world, being gifted the matrix means nothing, as strength is all that matters. And because of this, he is bested by Optimus in battle. Not because he is a weaker being, but because Optimus fights for the truth, that freedom is the right of all sentient beings, no matter how strong or weak they may be. But Megatron's life, unlike Sentinel's, is spared at the end of this battle. Banished from Iacon, Optimus watches as his former brother leaves, realizing that while Megatron is responsible for his evil actions, he is, at the end of the day, a product of the system that others had instated. I can't tell you how happy I was to see this film not treat Megatron's birth as an effect of some higher power. I feared that Megatronus, or the Fallen, would be present and that D-16 would fall in with prior teachings of Decepticonism, or even worse, that in taking Megatronus' T-Cog, he would then instantly go down a path of villainy. Having Megatron be a victim of a stunted social structure was the right choice from the filmmakers, as it makes his evolution into Megatron that much more tragic, and at the same time, relatable. We have all been wronged in life before, and while we may like to see ourselves as noble individuals like Optimus, it's safe to say that the easier path to go down is that of personal vengeance. D-16 was the standout character for me in this entire film. Upon my first viewing, I was very impressed with Brian Tyree Henry's performance as the character, but it wasn't until my second viewing that I truly experienced the absolute gravity of his performance. Henry's understanding of the character is undeniable, and he most definitely should be recognized for his performance. And Henry's mastery of the character is even furthered when you take the time to investigate his personal history with villain roles. He states in several interviews that he always grew up with the villain toys from franchises, but that to him, they were never any different than the heroes. They were never less than, as he says.
I've always wanted to play villains because I never saw them as that. I never once, when I got these villain toys, thought that they were villains. Like, I still play with them like they were superheroes, that they were bigger than life. I never ever once thought that they were less than. And I think that that's what happens sometimes when we are given these stories, is that they present these villains to us and they're like, you shouldn't like them. This is who they are. Usually something with their background, socioeconomic status, their race, their sex, like all that stuff, that everything is against them. And I never believed that. I was just like, nah, there's something else, man. Like, there's something else to that. And so to be able to step into the shoes of Megatron was very important to me, because also growing up, I didn't see cartoons reflecting my life. I didn't see a lot of black voice actors. I didn't see a lot of characters that even looked like me.
Now, of course, in some stories, like other iterations of Transformers, things are black and white, good guys versus bad guys. Stories like these do have purpose and meaning, but Henry and his fellow castmates make sure that Transformers 1 has more to its characters. He mentions that the villain of a story is usually seen as such simply because of the environment they grew up in, oftentimes portrayed as someone with differing opinions, pasts, or even racial backgrounds. But this channel is dedicated to Transformers, not socioeconomic or racial issues in the real world, so let's stay on topic. It's safe to say that Megatron is the villain of this movie, and yet Brian Tyree Henry would probably ask you, is Megatron really a villain, or is he the hero of his own story? Once again, we could speak endlessly on this argument, as many do, but what's more important is to understand the rift that has grown between brothers in this film. Both Orion and D-16 wanted the same thing, a better future for themselves and their planet, but their ways of achieving these goals and how the new status quo should be implemented is what drives them apart in the end. They both want the same thing, a unified Cybertron, but in the end, they each had different ways of bringing it to fruition. As I stated at the start of this video, this concept for these two characters is not wholly new to the franchise. We have seen similar origin stories for Megatron and Optimus before, but I can't help but praise Transformers 1 for manifesting it in what feels like the perfect way. Megatron's rise to power is not just tragic, it's also exciting and somewhat enticing. You know the D-16 will become a tyrant, and yet, while you overall hope he doesn't, you know that he has to, and you enjoy watching that journey. That, in my opinion, is the true mark of great writing. Not being able to keep the audience in the dark, but making them care so much that they are conflicted about what they know will happen. We need to address an issue that some have brought up with D-16's journey to becoming Megatron. The pacing of Transformers 1 has been mentioned many times on this channel, and in my original review of the movie with my wife, I actually said that the pacing of the film didn't bother me at all. Upon a second viewing, I have to amend that statement and say that I can now understand people's issues with how fast the movie moves along. However, I cannot agree that the movie needs to be 30 minutes longer. A lot of the emotional weight in D-16's story arc is conveyed through the emotions rather than the dialogue. If you're swept up in the grandiose scale of the film, then it's easy to miss the quieter, simpler moments where we see D's view of the world start to crumble. Most notably, we see that he as a character always has some bit of rage built underneath the surface. He doesn't physically use this rage against Orion, but he often has outbursts in protest against his brother.
Crazy! Sure feels like it.
But D-16's emotions are also on display in the Prime's gravesite, where he is face to face with Megatronus' corpse. We see just a hint of sadness, which then turns to anger. The art director and animators of this movie did a wonderful job designing the eyes of the Transformers, allowing us to see what's going on in their heads. We all know the eyes are the windows to the soul, and in this scene, D-16's spark is bared wide open for us to see.
One of the things I wanted to make really clear with the design of these characters is that their eyes need to be really legible so that we can play with something like this where you can see those little eye darts and everything. That's how you show a character's really thinking.
Again, because of the movie's quicker pace, I think it's easy to lose sight of this amidst the action and comedy. There's a lot of ground to cover and little time to do it in. D-16 doesn't become evil when he receives his T-Cog. He simply becomes more whole. Alphatron even tells us that it's not the cog that defines a bot, but the spark in his core. D's spark has not necessarily changed, but has more fully matured. He has gone from a devout follower of the system to realizing he was never important. He often explains that Sentinel lied to him, but it's more than just that. It's the fact that D's entire life, his purpose, was a fabrication. His anger, while rightfully directed at Sentinel, is a representation of a man who has been wronged by the system he so eagerly believed in. D-16 doesn't become Megatron because he is evil in his core, but rather he is truly unleashed due to broken promises of a society built on lies. Every miner on Cybertron faces this truth as well. Megatron's rage isn't just for himself, but for his entire people. After he murders Sentinel, he proclaims the age of false leaders is over. He is now the authority over Cybertron. One thing that I do wish we saw at the end of the film was the departure of some miners with Megatron and the High Guard. I might have missed it in repeat viewings, but it seemed like Megatron exits Iacon with only Starscream and his fellow minions following. It would have been nice to see others that have the same thought process as him follow. However, I'm sure this can be expanded upon in the sequels. And before you mention Darkwing in the comments, while I do think it's fair to assume that he would leave Iacon with Megatron, I more specifically would like to have seen other characters who endured the same lies as Megatron leave with him. Darkwing, as much of an ass as he is, flourished underneath Sentinel's lies and did not face the same prejudice that the miners did.
It's not like he can transform.
Hey, Darkwing! Don't. My finger can transform. Guess which one? Allow me.
We don't really get an explanation behind the Decepticon moniker, but I think it's safe to pull from other similar continuities as to why the name was chosen. In Transformers Prime, Megatron expertly explains the group's name by stating, "If speaking the truth is a deception, then we are gladly guilty." Again, the sequel to Transformers 1 may expand on this idea, or even give us a different reason altogether, but for now, I think it's alright to use this reasoning. After all, the Autobots' names are derived from finally being autonomous and having the right to choose their own path. All of this being said, I do understand the argument that D-16's turn to villainy is a little abrupt. Upon my first watch of the film, I turned to my wife right after he dropped Orion and whispered, "That was fast." But reflecting back on the story, I don't think that his turn was executed too quickly, but rather we weren't given enough time to notice the change happening. Now, adding 30 minutes to the film would not help this or any other issues in my opinions. 30 minutes is a huge chunk of time that would have to have been spread out throughout the entire film. It's practically a third of the film. Maybe 5 extra minutes would have helped to give us a little more breathing room to fully contemplate D-16's descent into villainy. It's not the fact that the character isn't given the time, but rather that the audience isn't given the time to adjust to the change. After all, we do get multiple scenes of D-16 acting more and more like his true self, while Orion questions if he's okay. But those scenes are quickly followed up by intense moments, like the introduction of the High Guard. But at the end of the day, art is subjective, and these are only my opinions on the characters and what the filmmakers were trying to convey. So the real question is, what did you think of D-16, his brotherhood with Orion, and his eventual evolution into Megatron? Did it feel rushed to you? Maybe it wasn't the timing that bothered you, but the actual events that brought about his villainous side. I'd love to hear your thoughts down in the comments about this character. And don't worry, I will be doing the other main cast members as well in due time. I'm going to take these videos whenever I get the inspiration to make them, and then we'll be talking about each one of them at a time. I'm pretty sure that Orion is going to be up next, then probably Alita, and then Bumblebee. Maybe those two will get switched around, you never know. Thank you guys, as always, so much for watching the channel and all the content I produce. I'll see you guys all on the next one.